Our next talk is by Ethan Friedland, who is a graduate student in Iranian Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, again here at UCLA, coming to us after he received his bachelor's degree in history at the American University. His interests include religious developments during and after the Achaemenid period. He aims to study how the multicultural religious traditions of the empire influenced Iranian religious traditions and vice versa. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming him, even though he's here on Zoom, for his talk entitled Tracing Old Iranian Syntax, an Achaemenid Sociolect in the Book of Esther.
So thanks so much, Professor Burke, and thank you to the organizers of the conference and the Portavood Institute at large, and everyone putting up for a virtual involvement. I've been watching everything on Zoom, and I'm very grateful to do so. So the diachronic and geographic origin of the Book of Esther remains an unresolved question. A study of Esther's language is, in theory, a more concrete means of determining the story's origin, as opposed to the study of more subjective categories such as genre or theme. However, language is not always an accurate representation of the context from which it arises. Authors can use archaizing words and formulae or employ different registers, thereby hindering contemporary efforts to locate the text in its time and place. The study of syntax, by contrast, is a more reliable means of determining a text's origin. Syntactic differences are less explicit than lexical differences. For example, it's easier for me to add in archaizing words like thy and thou than it is for me to emulate Shakespearean syntax and iambic pentameter. Therefore, an analysis of syntax can provide either a more reliable, yet still flawed, assessment of the author's origin, or, more reliably, an assessment of authorial style and perhaps even intent. The Persian milieu of Esther is a vital aspect of the storytelling. It sets a scene and immerses us in it, and the language plays a crucial part. Beyond its numerous Iranian loanwords, which Professor Bonisho and Professor Holm have already noted, Esther contains a number of borrowed phrases or calques from Old Persian. Potential Iranian syntactic influence, or emulation of Iranian syntax, is also evident in Esther's heavy use of passive constructions. In this brief presentation, I highlight two passages in Masoretic Text Esther that suggest an additional syntactic borrowing. The use of agential constructions in Esther 4:3 and 5:12 indicates a line of influence from Old Iranian into late Biblical Hebrew, likely through the mediation of Achaemenid-official Aramaic, the language of the Persian bureaucracy. Such a conclusion, if borne out in the text, would contribute to our understanding of Esther's origin. What I'll do in the following presentation is demonstrate the productivity and flexibility of the Old Iranian agential in Avestan and Old Persian, and then demonstrate how that exact syntax filters into Achaemenid-official Aramaic, and then how the Hebrew text of Esther picks that up for its own purposes. To give us an idea of the geographic distribution of the texts, and to look at least one image before we dive into the text, perhaps never to return, we know that the Old Persian inscriptions come from the blue circled areas, and we know that the Achaemenid-official Aramaic that I will discuss today comes from the red circled areas. And I'm too scared to tell a room full of biblicists where I think the books of Ezra, Daniel, and Esther come from, so we will just skip that. Now, the agential construction. Tamar E. Gindin argues that there are two attestations of this construction in Esther, but attributes these devices to authorial negligence, writing, "The use of slavish syntax may reflect occasional carelessness or ineptitude either in the arts of translation or in one of the languages. It may also suggest that the writer thinks in Persian." Gindin does not note the prevalence of this syntactic construction in Old Iranian, nor its frequency in the Achaemenid-official Aramaic epistolary, the letters. By accounting for this broader body of evidence, I suggest that Esther's use of the agential construction is not an ineptitude, but rather an intentional choice to cultivate an Achaemenid atmosphere with a genuine Old Persian sociolect, that is, the dialect or style of the Iranian elite. So first, what is the agential construction? The agential is a passive verbal construction that makes use of an agent to indicate the performer of the action. A simple passive construction reads, the book was purchased. An agential construction reads, the book was purchased by me. Here, the transitive passive verb matches the subject, the book, and the agent, me, is in an oblique case representing the actor behind the action. Bill T. Arnold and John H. Choi, in their study of Hebrew syntax, assert that constructions with a specified agent are virtually non-existent in biblical Hebrew. That makes their presence in Esther all the more noteworthy. By contrast, the agential construction is well attested in the earliest extant phases of the Indo-Iranian language group. The Indo-Iranian languages form the agential construction by combining a passive participle, a middle or passive finite verb, or gerundive with an agent marked by an oblique case. The past passive participle is by far the most common means of forming the agential, but it's not the only means. This construction is a frequent and grammatically regular feature of the Rig Veda and the Gathas, some of the oldest texts that we have, suggesting the antiquity of this phenomenon. Old Persian, perhaps the most recent attestation of Old Iranian, evinces a formulaic use of the agential due to the formulaic nature of the texts in question. Beginning in the late Achaemenid period, these Old Persian agentials would eventually develop into the Middle Persian ergative construction, which was the exclusive means by which Middle Persian conveyed past transitive action. My intent in the following slides is to demonstrate the antiquity and diversity of the Indo-Iranian agentials, especially constructions without participles, in order to justify the maximalist approach I will take to the Aramaic and Hebrew evidence. So this isn't a linguistic conference, and I won't bog us down with too much of the abundant and diverse examples. Instead, I'll just show a single line of Avestan, part of the Old Iranian language group, in which we find two agential constructions right next to each other, one with a finite verbal form and one with a past participle. Again, my intent is to demonstrate how flexible this construction can be. So then she spoke, good Ushi, who is exalted. None of these libations will be accepted by me, which any maidens unapproached by men offer to me. So we see in the same passage, present optative middle, a finite verbal form with an agent functioning in an agential construction alongside a past participle, an agent in an oblique case. And this is just, the tip of the iceberg of the diversity of the agential construction in Old Iranian, which we will see here in Old Persian. In Old Persian, the field is familiar with the extremely common monokartam agential construction. And since I'm sick, I'm not going to roll any R's today. But what this does is it makes use of a past participle and a genitive dative agent, usually mana, meaning by me. We see that in the first example from Xerxes, a past participle kurtum repeated with two different agents, me and my father, mana and pisa. This construction is understood as the influence behind the agential construction in Achaemenid-official Aramaic. As I seek to demonstrate, however, we see agential constructions with both past participles and finite verbal forms, and this too would eventually make its way into Aramaic. We see this in the second example from Darius at Bisatun with a passive finite verb ayadiyat, and it conveys the same sense. Darius the king says, those Elamites were evil, and Ahura Mazda was not worshipped by them. Old Persian also makes use of particles, as we will see in Aramaic, to convey agential constructions with finite verbs. From Darius again, we see a third singular imperfect indicative passive, that is a finite verb, and an agent which is attached to a particle, hacha. So what was said to them by me. And we see a similar construction with the postposition radi, making again use of a finite verbal form and a genitive dative agent. And so the weak were treated poorly by the powerful. So now we've seen the four ways that Old Persian can form this construction within what is a very tiny and rigid and formulaic corpus. So this diversity here is remarkable, and we will see this extend into Aramaic. To recap, we've seen a very flexible agential construction in Old Persian. However, that wasn't always the understanding. The mid-20th century belief was that the Old Persian agential was the exclusive means of, was exclusively constructed with past participles. And scholars familiar with Syriac, a later stage of Aramaic, connected this to the Katil-Lee agential construction, which is formed exclusively with a past participle and an agent in lamed. And therefore, the conclusion was that the agential in Achaemenid-official Aramaic must be equally rigid, exclusively consisting of a participle and a lamed. However, as we've seen, the diversity of Old Persian and Old Iranian agentials permits a re-examination of the Aramaic evidence. And for some of the early work on the more diverse Aramaic agential without the Iranian background, Margarita Fulmer's study is incredibly helpful here. So the agential construction first appears in Aramaic in the 5th century BCE epistolary corpora of Achaemenid-official Aramaic, namely the Arshama letters and the letters from Elephantine and Bactria. These are letters of official, bureaucratic nature, the correspondence between Achaemenid provincial officials and their subordinates. Of note, we find these agential constructions almost exclusively in the letters. Kutcher noted that the absence of agentials in the Aramaic copy of the Bisitun inscription and attributed this to its early date before the Iranian agential could enter Aramaic syntax. It's more likely, however, that Darius Bisitun Aramaic doesn't employ agential constructions because it derives from the Babylonian rather than Old Persian copy of the Bisitun inscription. Without an exhaustive survey, I can't say much about the other Aramaic sources from the Achaemenid Empire. However, at the moment it appears that the agential construction occurs extensively in formal epistolary correspondence and almost nowhere else. So what does it look like in Aramaic? As mentioned before, some scholars have argued we should only identify Katil-Lee constructions as agentials. However, the 5th to 4th century attestations of the agential construction used the lamed and mean prepositions in almost equal measure, which most of us know as to and from. And this depends on the transitivity of the verb. A lamed agent is used for verbs of perception, so to know, to hear, to wish, and a min agent for direct transitive verbs like send and give, as the lamed usually marks the direct object of transitive verbs, and that's what it marks here. Further, we find Aramaic agentials making use of more than just participles, just like in Old Persian, other passive verbal forms, and finite verbs. Due to the diversity of agential constructions in Indo-Iranian, which make use of participles, finite verbs, gerundives, with an agent in most oblique cases, I suggest taking into account the syntagms that don't fit the rigid Katil-Lee structure, meaning we can look at something like a past participle plus mean or a passive finite verb plus lamed. So we find many of the agential constructions in the mouths of Iranian-speaking officials who presumably dictated their letters to scribes proficient in Aramaic who translated on the spot. Jan Tavernier argues that this context enabled numerous syntactic borrowings from Old Iranian to Aramaic. And once again, a reminder that I will be translating these very directly to demonstrate the agential syntax that we're talking about, but Kutcher, Gazella, Coghill, and others argue that they should reflect an active meaning, and in any other context, I would translate them as such. So, for example, our third passage here from Bactria, Bhagavant saying, "By you, instruction was sent to me to prepare until when the wall and the ditch are around Nishapaya." We should really read that as "you sent instruction to me," right? These are grammatically passive, but they connote an active sense. So let's break these down a little further, look at what is exactly forming these constructions. We see the expected passive participle plus agent construction as we have in Old Persian. And in the Achaemenid letters from both Egypt and Bactria, and that is from the western and eastern extremities of the empire, they used past participles with agents in lamed and mean in almost equal measure. This already complicates the understanding of a rigid Aramaic agential, which was supposed to only use the lamed, but, like Old Persian, is more flexible than we give credit. Further, we find passages like the third example using a finite verb, here a GT imperfect, and a mean or lamed to convey the agential. Our brief look at Old Persian evidence suggests that this is completely regular. It conveys the same sense. By you, an action was done. In other words, you did the action. There are two examples where we find a passive participle and an apparently unmarked agent. Both passages belong to the late 4th century BCE Bactrian corpus and likely reflect the nascent Middle Iranian ergative system. The Middle Iranian ergative doesn't require any particle, like a lamed or a min, to mark the agent. Rather, it marks the agent in the oblique cases, but the oblique is often indistinguishable from the rectus in the singular. The Middle Iranian ergative, to clear up some of these confusions, usually raises the agent to the beginning of the clause, as we've seen in the following examples. So first we have now, if thus it is according to which was sent to me by that vahya atar. We have a G participle passive, what we've come to expect from earlier. And then we have the name, vahya atar, which cannot be any other component in the sentence. It can't be the subject. It can't be the direct object. It has to be the agent of this passive verbal form. The next one is even more striking. Afterwards, when barley, wheat, and millet were measured by Nafa Barzana. What we have here is another past participle and a name which can serve no other purpose but as an agent. But here the participle is a calque of Old Iranian. It's essentially a frozen Iranian form thrown into Aramaic, ni mita. So here we see the continued influence of Iranian into Aramaic such that the ergative system is seeping in here at the very end of the Achaemenid period. And as a reminder, the ergative system is meant to be read actively. And so again, we should probably be reading these as something like Vahya Antar sent it to me. Now, we also find quite a few agential constructions in communications between non-Iranians. It's likely that the formulae and styles of official correspondence spread from Iranian speakers to their non-Iranian subjects, especially those directly serving the Persian state. And this should be of interest to us as we're talking about life in the diaspora. Even when communicating privately, these non-Iranian subjects would seek to emulate the sociolect, the specific style of the imperial officials. Here, a forthcoming article by Tyler Jarvis, who just spoke on the imperial aspirations of the Judean garrison, will be particularly instructive, and I'm looking forward to its publication. So, looking at the letters of the Judeans at Elephantine, we find a syntax identical to that in the other letters, usually making use of a passive participle. I wrote this letter when it was thus heard by us that, and quite a famous one, it is known by you that Khanum is against us since Hananiah has been in Egypt until now. And again, I can't say this enough. I'm translating this so woodenly so that we can notice the agential construction, but we really should be knowing that we should be reading it as you know that Khanum has been against us. These are all a similar structure to what we've seen already. We're finding passive participles and agents in either lam or min, and we're also finding finite verbal forms. Here, another GT imperfect third masculine singular, let a letter be sent by you. So this same diversity of agentials continues no matter who is speaking. The brief biblical Aramaic corpus contains a disproportionate amount of agential constructions. The examples in Ezra occur in the letters between the Achaemenid king and his satrapal officials, and accounting for minute dialectical differences, these constructions are identical to the examples given above in the perhaps more genuine Achaemenid letters. Whether the author or authors of Ezra quoted genuine letters or sought to emulate a style that they knew of, it is evident that the agential is the expected form for official communications. In Daniel, we find the agential constructions in the dialogue between the king, by whom orders are issued, and the speech of his courtiers, and once in the narration itself. So here we see the exact same constructions, making use of passive participles and agents in either min or lamed. Let it be known by the king that the Jews who went up from your side to us have come to Jerusalem. By me an order was issued, and they inquired, and they found that this city from days eternal has risen against kings. And again, we should really read this as I issued an order. I won't even parse these for you any further because this is, it should be getting quite redundant, right? We see how this structure works. Now, this takes us into Esther. We've seen that the agential construction is so common in biblical Aramaic. We've seen that it's so common in the letters of Achaemenid-official Aramaic, and this is all coming from Old Persian. Now, the Hebrew Book of Esther contains two potential agential constructions, once in narration, once in speech. These clauses parallel the numerous Aramaic examples that we saw earlier. Much like the examples in biblical Aramaic, the author or authors of Esther would have sought to emulate an Achaemenid-style court speech in order to contribute to the Persian atmosphere of the story. First, we have a passage identified by others as an agential, and I'd like to thank Professor Bonisho for talking about this with me. Unfortunately, in this case, we have natan here as natun, a passive participle. And this is a directly transitive verb, which means it must take a direct object in lamed. You must give something to someone, right? A recipient. It's feasible that the particle of the agent could be flexible, but with the direct transitive verb, the lamed must always reflect the direct object. So getting that out of the way, we can turn to the stronger cases for the agential in Esther. And again, I'm translating woodenly, but I suggest an active connotation. Starting with Esther 4:3, in each province there was a place where the word of the king and his law reached, and in that place there was a great mourning by the Jews, and a fast, and a weeping and wailing, and sackcloth, and ashes were scattered by many Jews. And Esther 5:12, and don't worry, I will break these down individually in a second. Esther 5:12, so Haman said, also Queen Esther had summoned none other than me, along with the king to the banquet that she had made, and tomorrow too I am summoned by her along with the king. So let's start here with Esther 4:3. Ashes were scattered by many Jews. First thing to note is that ashes, afer, is a collective noun. It's a singular, and I'm translating it into English as a plural, so it's more readily understood. And what we have here is a C imperfect passive, so this is a hofal verb, a finite verbal form making use of a lamed agent. And the Masoretic pointing gives us yutsa. Yatsa is an intransitive verb in Hebrew, and to demonstrate this, I included a particularly arresting passage from Psalms that I just thought was fun. If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I scatter to Sheol, there you are too. So here, yatsa, scatter is not, you are not scattering something, you are essentially being scattered. It's intransitive, even when it is not in the passive sense. So despite some variances between Aramaic to Hebrew, this agential should look pretty familiar and can be readily understood in the same fashion. Moving on to Esther 5:12, we have Esther, the queen, had summoned me to the banquet. I am summoned or called by her. So what we have here is a G participle passive, which in Hebrew is marked by an internal vav instead of Aramaic internal yod. And now, kara is ambitransitive. It is sometimes directly transitive, and we'd expect an agent in mean and an object of motion in lam, but I don't think that's the case here. So first, with our lam agent, the Masoretic pointing is la. It lets us know that it is feminine, it is by her. Now, grammatically, the object of motion, the area that one is summoned to, would be masculine. This is the mishteh, the banquet. And the famous passage in Esther 4:11 demonstrates that the object of motion in summon takes an ale prefix, aleph lam, to the king and to his court. So any man or woman who goes to the king, el hamelech, sorry, that was Aramaic, any man or woman who goes to the king to his inner court without being summoned is put to death. The same ale is used in our passage here, 5:12. Queen Esther summoned none other than me to the banquet, and I am summoned by her. Within the story of Esther, the queen's agency and her waxing control over the court is a central theme, and hence why she is so central in this passage and really all the passages beginning in, I think, Esther 5. And that's why I suggest that she is the agent here rather than the passive recipient of this construction. Now, the Greek equivalents to the selected passages in the Masoretic Text of Esther seem to complicate the agential readings, but actually they strengthen them. These Greek passages do not employ agential constructions, though they are known in Greek, and sometimes they offer an active construction instead, so they spread sackcloth and ashes for themselves. Initially, this appears to be a strong argument against the presence of the agential constructions in Esther. However, an investigation of the Greek renditions of Hebrew and Aramaic agentials tempers this counterargument. The Greek rendition of the Hebrew agential is inconsistent, but most often it seems to capture the active meaning that the agential in truth conveys. So, for one, we have the Septuagint rendering the Masoretic text of Isaiah 53:5. He is wounded by our transgressions as exactly the same thing, making use of a passive verbal form. On the other hand, the Septuagint renders Masoretic text Genesis's nifal construction, and the Lord was entreated by him, as active. God listened to him. Compare also the passive nifal construction in Proverbs 14:20, a poor man is despised even by his peers, with the Greek, friends will hate their poor friends. Again, translating with the active sense we've come to expect when you're not offering horrid wooden translations to prove a point about the agential construction. Kutscher offers in another interesting example the distinctly Iranian-influenced bilingual Serapit stela at Armazi, which gives two parallel sayings, one in Aramaic, one in Greek. The Aramaic reads, "A wealth of victories was made," and the Greek, on the other hand, reads, "They made many victories." The Greek renders the active meaning of the phrase rather than the grammatically passive syntax, and this is, of course, consistent with the active meaning of agentials evident in Achaemenid-official Aramaic, Biblical Aramaic, and Middle Iranian, and conceivable in Old Iranian. Again, these are semantically active constructions in a passive garb, and the Greek appears to recognize that. So, to recap, the agential construction is a productive and flexible feature of Old Iranian, as we briefly saw in Avestan and more extensively in Old Persian. It emerged in Achaemenid-official Aramaic due to the influence of Iranian syntax at Achaemenid courts and scribal offices, and there it served as a sociolect, a specific style indicating Iranian identity, proximity to power in epistolary contexts. And this heavily influenced Biblical Aramaic constructions and perceptions of the Achaemenid world. In fact, it's one of the primary ways that Biblical Aramaic indicates to the reader that this occurs in the court setting. Now, Esther either originates directly from this Achaemenid environment, as some of the folks in prior presentations have argued, or consciously emulates this style in order to construct an authentic Achaemenid atmosphere complete with loanwords and lavish palace culture. Regardless, this is not a slavish imitation of the Persian milieu, but rather a compelling artistic choice without which the story we know would be incomplete. As a parting note, I'd like to suggest the potential that syntactic studies can offer scholars of the Achaemenid world, and particularly the interactions between the Iranian-speaking elites and the subject communities speaking and writing in Aramaic and Hebrew and other languages. Of note, the three official Achaemenid-official Aramaic corpora I've engaged with, replete with agential constructions, occur in locations that appear under the direct military and bureaucratic control of the empire, and these are our red circles. The blue circles represent Aramaic corpora from the Achaemenid period that I've had time to examine non-exhaustively. Of note, these texts exist outside of direct Achaemenid oversight in more autonomous regions like Idumea, and as expected, they do not employ agential constructions. There's much more to be done, but I hope we can begin using syntax as a means of discovering direct Achaemenid engagement with their many and myriad subject peoples. Thank you.